They whisper to themselves that you meant nothing. They craft elaborate narratives of indifference, painting themselves as the emotionally superior beings who can discard connections like yesterday's newspaper. The avoidant has perfected the art of self-deception, believing they possess some mystical ability to cleanse their hearts of inconvenient attachments. But here lies the uncomfortable truth they refuse to acknowledge. Their very attempt to erase you proves your profound significance. You see, the avoidant doesn't try to forget people who truly don't matter. They don't construct elaborate mental fortresses against memories that hold no power. The sheer energy they invest in pushing you away reveals the depth of your impact on their carefully guarded inner world. Their desperation to forget you is, paradoxically, a confession of how deeply you've marked them. What they call emotional maturity is often emotional cowardice dressed in sophisticated language. They've convinced themselves that their inability to process attachment is somehow wisdom, that their fear of vulnerability is strength. Yet every sleepless night spent building walls against your memory tells a different story. Every calculated move to avoid reminders of you screams the truth they refuse to speak. You have become permanently woven into the fabric of who they are, and no amount of psychological gymnastics can change that reality. The phantom limb of attachment. The avoidant has convinced themselves that emotional amputation is a skill to be proud of. They wear their ability to cut people off like a badge of honor, as if the capacity to sever human connections demonstrates some superior form of emotional evolution. But what they refuse to acknowledge is that their phantom attachment syndrome isn't an unfortunate side effect. It's the natural consequence of trying to deny fundamental human wiring through their own emotional negligence. They created this phantom pain through their cowardly approach to human connection. When genuine intimacy threatened their carefully constructed isolation, they chose the path of least emotional responsibility, sudden severance, rather than honest communication. Now they live with the psychological equivalent of having performed surgery on themselves with a rusty blade, wondering why the wound won't heal cleanly, while simultaneously refusing to seek proper treatment. The avoidance body rebels against their conscious choices with relentless persistence, and they have no one to blame but themselves. Their nervous system, unchanged by their mental gymnastics, continues to reach for what they've deliberately discarded. They feel your absence like a missing tooth. Their tongue can't stop probing, yet they blame this discomfort on your supposed toxicity, rather than their own emotional immaturity and inability to process endings like a functioning adult. Most tellingly, they suffer from this phantom attachment precisely because they never learned to do the hard work of relationship closure. Instead of allowing natural resolution through honest conversation and gradual transition, they perform emotional hit-and-runs, leaving both parties wounded and unresolved. The phantom pain is their psyche's way of demanding the emotional labor they refuse to perform. The difficult discussions, the acknowledgement of mutual humanity, the mature recognition of what was actually shared. Their sleep disturbances aren't random neurological misfirings. They're the direct result of unfinished emotional business that they chose to abandon rather than address. The avoidant subconscious mind works over time, trying to process what their conscious mind refused to engage with honestly. They've created their own psychological haunting through emotional negligence, yet they wonder why peace eludes them while taking no responsibility for their self-imposed torment. The phantom limb throbs most painfully in moments of genuine quiet, when their elaborate distraction mechanisms fail to drown out the echo of what they destroyed. They feel the weight of conversations that will never happen, not because fate intervened, but because they lack the courage to stay present for difficult emotions. The avoidant reaches for their phone with muscle memory of texting you, only to remember the deliberate void they created through their own emotional cowardice. What makes their phantom attachment particularly pathetic is how they've romanticized their own dysfunction. They speak of their ability to move on quickly as if it were a superpower rather than a profound incapacity for emotional processing. They mistake numbness for strength, avoidance for wisdom, and emotional abandonment for healthy boundaries. The phantom pain serves as their psyche's rebellion against this elaborate self-deception. Their autonomic nervous system refuses to play along with their conscious performance of indifference. Stress hormones surge when they encounter places you once shared, not because you possess some magical hold over them, but because their body remembers the vulnerability they allowed before their fear took over. The amygdala, that primitive guardian of emotional truth, continues to scan for threats to a bond that they deliberately severed through their own emotional immaturity. The avoidant learns to live with this ghostly presence because acknowledging its source would require admitting their own role in creating it. They prefer to suffer in phantom silence rather than confront the reality that healthy relationships require the kind of emotional courage they've never developed. The phantom limb of attachment becomes their permanent companion, a constant reminder of their capacity for connection and their equal capacity for destroying it through fear. Most damning of all is how they've turned their phantom pain into evidence of your supposed power over them, rather than recognizing it as proof of their own emotional inadequacy. They carry this phantom attachment, not because you were irreplaceable, but because they never learned to replace fear with courage, avoidance with presence, or emotional abandonment with mature communication. The phantom limb throbs with the rhythm of their own choosing, a self-inflicted wound they refuse to properly treat while blaming you for the infection. The architecture of avoidant memory. The avoidant brain doesn't just store memories differently, it actively constructs elaborate psychological monuments to their own emotional cowardice, while pretending these structures serve protection rather than preservation. Their compartmentalization isn't the sophisticated emotional management system they believe it to be. It's a psychological museum dedicated to their own inability to process human connection like a mature adult. They built these memory chambers as emotional panic rooms, places to hide from the vulnerability you represented rather than learning to navigate intimacy with courage. But in their architectural arrogance, they failed to understand a fundamental principle of psychology. Compartmentalization doesn't eliminate emotional content. It crystallizes it in perfect condition, like a time capsule buried in their psyche. You remain exactly as you were when they first sealed you away, preserved in the amber of their own emotional incompetence. The avoidance memory system reveals their fundamental dishonesty about emotional processing and their own role in relationship dynamics. They claim to have moved on while simultaneously maintaining a detailed archive of every moment you shared, catalogued with the precision of an obsessive curator. Their hippocampus, that dutiful librarian of experience, has preserved your essence with meticulous care, creating multiple backup copies across different neural networks, not because you demanded this preservation, but because they never learned to process endings properly. What makes their memory architecture particularly damning is its selective editing designed to absolve them of emotional responsibility. They remember your flaws with laser precision while conveniently deleting their own contributions to relationship dysfunction. This isn't accidental neural processing. It's deliberate historical revision designed to support their narrative of justified abandonment. They become the unreliable narrator of their own emotional story, editing out their cowardice while highlighting your supposed crimes against their independence. Yet even as they rewrite history to cast themselves as the rational party who had no choice but to flee, they cannot delete the emotional weight of what was lost. Their amygdala, that primitive guardian of emotional truth, refuses to be fooled by their conscious revisionism. It maintains the original emotional recordings in high-definition clarity, immune to their attempts at retroactive justification. The avoidant may rewrite the story, but they cannot rewrite the feelings, and this discrepancy creates a cognitive dissonance that haunts their quiet moments. Most revealing is how their memory palace becomes a sprawling museum dedicated entirely to you, despite their claims of indifference and desire to forget. They may never visit these chambers consciously, but their existence shapes the entire architectural landscape of their psyche. Every new relationship must navigate around these sealed sections, like tourists walking around construction zones in their own heart. The avoidant has created a permanent memorial to their own emotional failure while pretending it's a monument to your supposed toxicity. Their memory architecture operates on the principle of emotional hoarding disguised as emotional minimalism. They claim to travel light through life, while simultaneously maintaining vast storage facilities dedicated to preserving every connection they claim didn't matter. The very existence of these elaborate preservation systems proves the lie of their indifference. People don't build archives for things that truly hold no significance. The structural engineering of their memory palace reveals the avoidant's deepest fear, that they might actually be capable of love if they weren't so terrified of its demands. So they build these chambers, not to forget you, but to safely remember you, without having to risk the vulnerability that genuine connection requires. It's emotional tourism. They can visit the feeling without paying the price of presence. What makes their memory architecture most pathetic is how it transforms their own emotional dysfunction into your supposed pathology. They preserve evidence of their capacity for connection while simultaneously maintaining that such connection was somehow dangerous or unhealthy. The avoidant becomes both the architect of their own emotional prison and the tour guide who blames the exhibits for their own curatorial choices. Their memory palace stands as a monument to what they could have been if they possessed the courage to stay present for difficult emotions instead of fleeing into the false safety of isolation. Every preserved moment serves as evidence not of your irreplaceable nature, but of their own untapped capacity for love and their equal capacity for sabotaging it through fear. They built this architecture themselves, brick by brick, choice by cowardly choice. Yet somehow you remain the villain in their carefully constructed narrative of emotional victimhood. The avoidance memory architecture ensures your permanent residence, not because you possess some supernatural hold over them, but because they never developed the emotional tools to process attachment and loss like a functioning adult. They created their own psychological haunted house and then wonder why they can't escape the ghosts they've so carefully preserved in its halls. The paradox of intentional forgetting. The avoidance relationship with forgetting exposes their deepest character flaw, the absolute refusal to take responsibility for their own emotional choices, while simultaneously expecting their psyche to comply with demands that violate basic human psychology. They've convinced themselves that their struggle to forget you is evidence of your pathological impact on their life, rather than the predictable consequence of their own psychological immaturity and refusal to process endings like a functioning adult. Their deliberate suppression efforts reveal a fundamental arrogance about human emotional architecture. They believe they can simply decide not to feel, as if emotions were optional software that could be uninstalled rather than core programming that defines human experience. This magical thinking about emotional control demonstrates the very arrested development that makes genuine intimacy impossible for them. They want the benefits of connection without accepting the responsibilities that come with loving another person. What they call moving on is actually an elaborate theatrical performance designed to convince themselves more than anyone else that they possess some superior form of emotional evolution. They monitor their own thoughts with the obsessive vigilance of a prison guard, noting every instance your memory surfaces and treating it like evidence of personal weakness rather than normal human attachment processing. This self-surveillance creates a feedback loop that ensures you remain constantly present in their awareness. They become their own psychological stalker while blaming you for the harassment. The white bear phenomenon that torments them isn't a cruel trick of psychology. It's their psyche's desperate attempt to force the emotional processing they've been avoiding through sheer stubborn cowardice. Their brain keeps bringing you to consciousness because there's unfinished emotional business that demands resolution, difficult conversations that were abandoned, and authentic feelings that were buried alive rather than properly grieved. But rather than doing the mature work of processing these emotions, they treat each memory like an enemy invasion to be repelled through increasingly desperate mental warfare. Their sleep becomes a nightly battleground precisely because they've declared war on their own emotional truth through their waking hours. The avoidant spends their days suppressing natural psychological processes with the determination of a totalitarian regime, then expresses surprise when their nights are filled with dreams that undo their carefully constructed amnesia. They've created their own psychological insomnia through emotional stubbornness, choosing exhaustion over honesty, mental warfare over emotional integration. Most damning is their refusal to recognize that the enormous energy required for constant suppression could have been invested in healthy emotional processing from the beginning. They choose the path of greatest psychological resistance, creating their own emotional hell through sheer determination to avoid feeling, then somehow find a way to blame you for the exhaustion that follows. The avoidant has turned forgetting into a full-time job that pays in suffering, yet you remain permanently employed in their consciousness, despite never submitting an application for the position. Their attempts at intentional forgetting reveal the fundamental contradiction at the heart of avoidant psychology. They desperately want to be unaffected while simultaneously investing tremendous energy in maintaining their affected state. They perform indifference with the dedication of a method actor while refusing to acknowledge that genuine indifference requires no performance at all. True forgetting happens naturally when proper emotional processing occurs, but the avoidant has chosen the path of forced amnesia over genuine healing. The irony reaches its peak when they realize that their very attempts to forget you have made you more memorable than any conscious effort at preservation could have achieved. They've accidentally created the most effective memory enhancement system possible, the forbidden fruit approach to consciousness. By making you taboo in their own mind, they've ensured your permanent fascination. Every suppressed thought becomes a monument to its own importance. What makes their intentional forgetting most pathetic is how it transforms them into the victim of their own emotional choices while casting you as the perpetrator of their self-inflicted psychological torture. They refuse to acknowledge that the reason forgetting feels so difficult is because the connection was real, the feelings were genuine, and the ending was handled with all the grace of a demolition crew. The avoidant has created their own psychological crime scene and then acts shocked at finding evidence of the violence they themselves committed against their own capacity for love. The silent archaeology of their hearts. The avoidant has transformed their emotional landscape into an archaeological site where you exist in permanent excavation, preserved beneath layers of calculated denial that they themselves deposited with the methodical precision of someone burying evidence of their own emotional crimes. What they refuse to acknowledge is that they became the curator of their own heart's museum, carefully preserving what they claimed to want destroyed, then expressing bewilderment at finding their collection so meticulously maintained. Their emotional archaeology reveals the most damning truth about avoidant psychology. They don't bury people who truly don't matter to them. Casual acquaintances fade naturally from memory without requiring elaborate burial rituals, complex preservation systems, or the kind of psychological construction project they've undertaken in your honor. But you required special handling, careful entombment beneath protective layers of rationalization and revisionist history, because your significance threatened their carefully constructed mythology of emotional independence. Each layer of their psychological stratigraphy tells the story of their emotional cowardice with scientific precision. The surface level displays their performed indifference, the casual mentions of moving on, the theatrical demonstrations of being over it, the carefully rehearsed monologues about personal growth and healthy boundaries. But excavate deeper, and the artifacts of genuine connection emerge with startling clarity, preserved in perfect condition by their own desperate attempts at burial. The avoidance archaeological preservation methods expose their fundamental dishonesty about the nature of human attachment and their own emotional capacity. They claim to value independence and emotional freedom, while simultaneously maintaining elaborate shrine-like chambers dedicated to relationships they supposedly want to forget. These buried treasures don't decompose naturally because they've been sealed in the amber of unprocessed emotion, protected from the natural decay that comes with healthy grieving and honest closure. What makes their emotional archaeology particularly damning is the selective nature of their preservation efforts. They maintain moments of connection and vulnerability with museum-quality care while burying their own emotional failures and relationship sabotage under layers of revisionist sediment. The avoidant becomes both the archaeologist and the vandal of their own emotional history, preserving evidence of what they felt while systematically destroying records of what they failed to provide, the courage they lacked, and the emotional work they refused to perform. Their heart's excavation site remains permanently active because they refuse to complete the archaeological work that would allow for proper historical integration instead of cataloging and contextualizing their emotional artifacts with the honesty required for genuine understanding. They simply keep burying them deeper, creating an unstable psychological foundation that threatens to collapse under the weight of accumulated denial and unprocessed truth. The most revealing aspect of their emotional archaeology is how it proves their own capacity for love, while simultaneously documenting their equal capacity for destroying it through fear. Every preserved moment serves as evidence that they are capable of genuine connection, authentic vulnerability, and deep emotional attachment, which makes their choice to abandon these capacities even more damning. They became archaeologists of their own potential, preserving proof of what they could be while choosing to remain what they are. You remain perfectly preserved in their depths, not because you possess some magical quality that made you unforgettable, but because they never developed the emotional tools necessary for proper relationship closure and grief processing. Their archaeological site becomes a monument to their own emotional immaturity, a permanent excavation that will never reach completion because they lack the courage to face what they've buried and take responsibility for their own curatorial choices in the museum of their heart, the silent archaeology of their hearts. The avoidant has transformed their emotional landscape into an archaeological site where you exist in permanent excavation, preserved beneath layers of calculated denial that they themselves deposited with the methodical precision of someone burying evidence of their own emotional crimes. What they refuse to acknowledge is that they became the curator of their own heart's museum, carefully preserving what they claim to want destroyed, then expressing bewilderment at finding their collection so meticulously maintained. Their emotional archaeology reveals the most damning truth about avoidant psychology. They don't bury people who truly don't matter to them. Casual acquaintances fade naturally from memory without requiring elaborate burial rituals, complex preservation systems, or the kind of psychological construction project they've undertaken in your honor. But you required special handling, careful entombment beneath protective layers of rationalization and revisionist history, because your significance threatened their carefully constructed mythology of emotional independence. Each layer of their psychological stratigraphy tells the story of their emotional cowardice with scientific precision. The surface level displays their performed indifference, the casual mentions of moving on, the theatrical demonstrations of being over it, the carefully rehearsed monologues about personal growth and healthy boundaries. But excavate deeper, and the artifacts of genuine connection emerge with startling clarity, preserved in perfect condition by their own desperate attempts at burial. The avoidance archaeological preservation methods expose their fundamental dishonesty about the nature of human attachment and their own emotional capacity. They claim to value independence and emotional freedom, while simultaneously maintaining elaborate shrine-like chambers dedicated to relationships they supposedly want to forget. These buried treasures don't decompose naturally because they've been sealed in the amber of unprocessed emotion, protected from the natural decay that comes with healthy grieving and honest closure. What makes their emotional archaeology particularly damning is the selective nature of their preservation efforts. They maintain moments of connection and vulnerability with museum-quality care while burying their own emotional failures and relationship sabotage under layers of revisionist sediment. The avoidant becomes both the archaeologist and the vandal of their own emotional history, preserving evidence of what they felt while systematically destroying records of what they failed to provide, the courage they lacked, and the emotional work they refused to perform. Their heart's excavation site remains permanently active because they refuse to complete the archaeological work that would allow for proper historical integration. Instead of cataloging and contextualizing their emotional artifacts with the honesty required for genuine understanding, they simply keep burying them deeper, creating an unstable psychological foundation that threatens to collapse under the weight of accumulated denial and unprocessed truth. The most revealing aspect of their emotional archaeology is how it proves their own capacity for love while simultaneously documenting their equal capacity for destroying it through fear. Every preserved moment serves as evidence that they are capable of genuine connection, authentic vulnerability, and deep emotional attachment, which makes their choice to abandon these capacities even more damning. They became archaeologists of their own potential, preserving proof of what they could be while choosing to remain what they are. You remain perfectly preserved in their depths, not because you possessed some magical quality that made you unforgettable, but because they never developed the emotional tools necessary for proper relationship closure and grief processing. Their archaeological site becomes a monument to their own emotional immaturity, a permanent excavation that will never reach completion because they lack the courage to face what they've buried and take responsibility for their own curatorial choices in the museum of their heart, the eternal echo chamber. The avoidant has created their own psychological echo chamber, where your voice reverberates endlessly through every future relationship and life choice, not because you possessed some supernatural hold over them, but because they never learned to process endings with the emotional maturity required of a functioning adult. What they refuse to admit is that this echo chamber exists as a monument to their own incapacity for closure, their inability to engage in the difficult conversations that allow relationships to end cleanly rather than festering in psychological purgatory. Every new person they encounter must compete with your ghost, not because you were somehow perfect or uniquely compelling, but because the avoidant never allowed themselves to experience complete resolution. They carry you forward as an unfinished emotional equation, a mathematical problem they abandoned rather than solved, then wonder why new relationships feel somehow incomplete or unsatisfying. The echo of your unprocessed connection drowns out the possibility of authentic new beginnings because they've never learned to properly bury their emotional dead. Their future choices reveal your continued influence with embarrassing clarity, like a compass that points permanently toward their own emotional inadequacy. They unconsciously seek or avoid certain qualities based on their buried comparison to you, organizing their entire romantic life around either replicating or avoiding what you represented. The avoidant may claim complete indifference while simultaneously structuring every subsequent connection around the template you provided, the positive space or negative space of their emotional blueprint, but always the defining shape around which everything else must be arranged. Most tellingly, the avoidance echo chamber amplifies not who you actually were, but the mythological version they needed you to be to justify their emotional abandonment. They've created a fictional character based loosely on your features, sometimes idealized beyond recognition, sometimes demonized beyond humanity, that serves their psychological narrative better than the complex reality of who you were. This manufactured echo becomes more real to them than your actual memory, a phantom constructed from their own emotional cowardice rather than historical fact. Their inability to silence your echo reveals the fundamental flaw in their attachment strategy and their complete misunderstanding of how human emotional processing actually works. By refusing to do the difficult work of proper closure, the honest conversations, the acknowledgement of what was shared, the mature recognition of mutual humanity, they've guaranteed your permanent residence in their psychological soundscape. The avoidant has created their own emotional tinnitus, a constant ringing of unresolved attachment that they've somehow convinced themselves is your fault, rather than the natural consequence of their own emotional immaturity. The echo persists because they've never learned the difference between ending a relationship and abandoning it. Endings require presence, honesty, and the courage to face difficult emotions. Abandonment requires only the ability to run, which they've perfected into an art form. But abandonment creates ghosts, and ghosts create echoes that reverberate through every quiet moment of their carefully constructed isolation. What makes their echo chamber most pathetic is how they've turned it into evidence of your supposed pathology, rather than their own emotional dysfunction. They speak of being haunted by you, as if you were some malevolent spirit, rather than the natural consequence of their own psychological negligence. The echo isn't your voice calling to them from beyond some imagined grave. It's their own emotional immaturity, reverberating through the hollow chambers of their underdeveloped heart. The echo chamber will persist until they develop the courage to face what they actually lost and take responsibility for how they chose to lose it. But this would require the kind of emotional honesty and self-reflection that the avoidant has spent their entire life avoiding. So your echo continues, not as a testament to your power over them, but as a permanent soundtrack to their own emotional cowardice, playing the song of what could have been if only they had possessed the bravery to stay and fight for connection, rather than flee into the false safety of emotional exile. They created this echo chamber through their own choices, maintained it through their own refusal to process difficult emotions, and now must live within its reverberating walls while somehow finding a way to blame you for the acoustics of their own emotional architecture. The echo isn't haunting them. They are haunting themselves with the ghost of their own untapped capacity for love.